Greetings, scholars. This is the remainder of the lecture on creating discipline problems that we didn't get to finish last week due to the snow days. In order to keep on track, we're going to have to keep moving forward, so we're not going to have time to go back to it. So I thought I'd put it on this little video for you. You can watch it sometime before the test the week from Thursday. We left off, I think, on this page, which is creating discipline problems. And the first one starts out, ignorance is bliss. And really what that means is that the first approach to solving a behavior problem is to see if you can ignore it. Because any behavior that repeats itself is being reinforced somehow, and sometimes unintentionally we reinforce a person's behavior by giving them reinforcements. For example, the class clown example would be a kid who acts out in class to get attention, and unwittingly, sometimes a teacher may fall into the trap by becoming frustrated with them, by calling them down in class. And it's usually a him too, by the way. Most of class clowns tend to be males rather than females. But if the teacher gives him attention for being the class clown, then obviously the behavior will increase. I'll give you a personal example. When I was in high school, I was a class clown. You'll probably find that hard to believe. But I used to shoot spitballs sometimes in math class, and I would have a spitball that would hit the chalkboard where the teacher was writing. And one time I did that, and I don't know why. I guess it's just to get attention. But one time when it happened, he turned around and he got so angry at me, he told me to go stand in the courtyard of the school for the rest of the day. This was in the afternoon. I went to school in southern Florida, partly cloudy, 80 degrees, birds were chirping, flowers were blooming, and I stood in the courtyard of the school for about an hour and a half, missed the classes I disliked the most. And by the end of the day, I was kind of like a school hero. Everybody'd come by and cheer and say, "Hey, watch this go, good job." So I got reinforced for the behavior for something that was supposed to have been a punishment. So you got to be really careful about that. The other example I gave in class was the little girl in kindergarten or a Head Start who dropped a box of crayons and said, "Oh shit," and the teachers ended up unintentionally and unwittingly reinforcing her by becoming so excited, and all the other kids watched, and pretty soon all the kids were chanting, "Oh shit, oh shit." Other examples, another example is things like if people tease you, for example, and you really don't want to be teased, if you react strongly to it, then they're more likely to increase the teasing because that's the result that they wanted. The second one on the list is to withdraw privileges. And again, this is a really good way to punish. Nowadays, kids have so many options of things you can withdraw: an iPad, a phone, games, curfews, all kinds of things like that can be withdrawn if a student does not do the kinds of behavior that are necessary. Those make very good punishments. Probably one of the most important elements of using punishment is to be consistent. This is the biggest crime that teachers and parents commit with their kids, is they're just not consistent. They'll promise things they won't deliver. They won't use the full force the first time. That's not immediate enough, and the punishment really doesn't fit the crime. So let me give you some examples. And let's start with being consistent. I've seen so many examples. I'll give you one for a teacher, for example, where a teacher has taught kids not to do what the teacher said until she repeats herself several times. I was in a middle school situation and sitting in the back of the room, and there were three girls that were just chatting away with each other. And the teacher, very nice, pleasant person, and I think the kids really liked her. The teacher said, "Okay, everybody, put your stuff away, get your books out, turn to page 57, it's time to get started." And many of the kids got their books out and got started. These three girls kept just chatting and talking and everything else, and then the teacher said again, "Okay, kids," I said, "now it's the time. Get everything put together. Get your books out, page 57. And these girls were still talking. And so I was just curious, and I said to one of the girls, "Well, the teacher said to get the books out. How come you all are not getting them out?" And this one girl looked at me and she said, "Well, she has to say it 3 times before she really means it." And sure enough, the teacher the third time said, "I said get your books out now. It's time to do this." And the girls put their stuff away and got ready to go. So by not being consistent, by promising things If you say things like, if you do this again, I'm sending you to your room. If you do this again, I'm sending you to the office. And then you don't do it, you're teaching kids to not believe you, and you're teaching kids not to be responsible for their own behavior. Give you another example. Let the punishment fit the crime and full force the first time. When my kids were probably 8 or 9 years old, we were living in Memphis, and we lived on a cul-de-sac. And as a parent, my wife and I always wanted to make sure that all the kids played near our house and in our yard. We had no grass in our front yard because um, we made it available for kids. We had a big front yard, and we made it available for kids to play soccer, to hang out in. We even supplied cookies and punch after school so that the kids would actually hang out there. Now, the main reason was so that we could see what the kids are up to. We could know who their friends are. Their friends would feel comfortable coming to the house. All those different kinds of things were really important to us. And so anyway, we usually had 10 or 12 kids after school playing in the front yard. And one little boy who lived down the street, he was several years younger than my kids. He was kind of like a feral child in the sense that his mother worked 2 jobs. He had an older brother who was in trouble a lot. And so he was pretty much left by himself and alone. He would roam the neighborhood, summer, winter, it didn't matter when, usually in shorts and frequently without a shirt on. And so he was in some ways very resilient, but also a problem. When he was in first grade, he pulled a knife on a teacher and got sent home from school, obviously. So anyway, he came down and he would play in the yard too, but he had a very big anger management issue, as some kids in situations like that would have. And he was prone to punching people if he didn't get his way. And so I just happened to be watching one day when they were playing out there, and they were playing soccer, and he didn't get the ball when he wanted it, so he ran up and punched somebody. And so I went out to him, and his name was Jason, and I said, Jason, if I want you, it's not acceptable to punch people, and I want you to know that if you punch someone again, I am going to send you home for a week. Do you understand that? Yeah, I understand that. And so I went back in, I was looking out the window, and about 2 minutes later, he didn't get his way again, and he hauled off and punched someone. And I walked out, and I said, Jason, I want you to go home for a week. And so he turned around, stormed off, and ran across the street, down a couple of houses where he lived. He kicked in his front door and went inside. Well, about 30 minutes later, he came back, and he was standing on the sidewalk, and he saw me, and he said, I'm sorry, I'm never going to do that again. Can I play? Now, what would the humane, really good person who thinks about long-term responsibility and discipline in terms of helping kids develop self-discipline, what would that person say? And the person would say, no, I said you're home for a week. A week's not over yet. Go home now and don't come back until a week is over. You must follow through with the punishment in order for a person to believe you. So he ran home again, kicked the front door in, and I would see him periodically over the course of that week, and he'd be peering around the bushes, looking and watching all the other kids play. And if he ever saw me, he'd turn around and run and kick the front door in, and run in the house again. Well, after a week was over, he came back and he was standing on the sidewalk, and he said, "Can I play? A week is over." And I said, "Do you know the rules?" And he said, "Yes, I know the rules." And I said, "Okay, then you can play." And he started playing, and I was watching again through the window. And he got really angry, and he was just about to punch someone, and instead he turned around, ran home, kicked the front door in, and didn't hit anybody. So he came back a few minutes later, but he didn't come in to play in the yard. He was standing on the sidewalk, and he said, "Can I play?" I said, "Did you hit anybody?" He said, "No, I didn't." I said, "Okay, you're good to go." So watching him after that, every time he'd start to lose his temper, he would turn around, he would stop, control himself, turn around, run home, kick the front door in, and but he never hit anybody. Now, it's not great to kick the front door in, but it's better than kicking someone's head in. You kick the front door in, you have to repair the door. If you kick someone's head in, sometimes you can't repair the damage, and that's going to send you to prison or someplace else. Well, he learned a lot of self-control, and he ended up being a superb kid. He ended up pretty much living with us and eating with us, and he became a third child in our family. Um, and he was always excellent. He was the first to offer help. He just needed that attention from someone. Anyway, because of just a little bit of attention and holding him accountable and responsible and not letting him get away with things was enough to change his behavior. And he, like John that I told you about in class, in the chemistry class, he was a really good kid who just needed a little bit of positive direction and someone to hold him accountable. Immediate punishment, if you're going to use punishment, that's really important. It doesn't work if you say wait till somebody gets home. If you come back 3 days later and you say, remember when you did this, you want to try to connect the event that's being punished in a very close time proximity, because it has to be an emotional connection. And so you have to administer the punishment when the emotion is readily available. So that's an important key. Punishment fit the crime. I can't remember if I told you this one in class about playing ball in the classroom. If so, you get to hear it again. I was playing ball at lunch in the classroom with a couple friends, and we threw the ball and it hit the light fixture that came crashing down to the floor and broke all over the floor. And just as we had done that, we heard Mrs. Ailey, our sixth grade teacher, coming, and she walked in. She was really great at making kids feel responsible. But she came in. We were standing there. We didn't say a thing. We were kind of petrified. And she walked up and she just looked at it and all the broken glass and fixture on the floor and looked at each of us and didn't say anything. And now, what do you think the question should be that a teacher should ask? You could ask what happened. Well, it's obvious what happened. Instead, she said, "Okay, boys, what are you going to do about it?" And so we started thinking, and we said, "Well, we're going to clean it up." And she said, "Yes." Said, and we're going to stay after school and try to make up for, doing this bad thing. And she said, "Yeah." And we're going to work and clean things after school, I think is what we said. And I said, we're going to save up our allowance and pay for it. And she said, "Yeah." And then we were thinking some more and said, "Well, we're going to tell our parents what we did." She said, "Yeah." Well, she would let us go on. And years later, I asked her how long she would let us go on about what we would do as punishment. And she said, "I would let you go as long as you need to, because who better knows what punishment fits the crime than the person who did it." So that was a very effective one, because you want to have the punishment fit the crime in the mind of the person who did the crime. And frequently we do punishments that we think would fit, but they really make no impact on the kid either. Full force the first time, again, that was a Jason example. There's one other one I'll give you that I'm not particularly proud of, but in my first year of teaching, I was teaching an earth science class, and I had two really smart boys who would always sit next to each other, and even during tests, they would kibitz. They would just kind of smirk and laugh, and they always got straight A's in everything they did. But it was annoying. They made it look like they were cheating. That's what they were trying to do. And so I said, "Boys, I don't want you sitting next to each other again when we take a test. If you're sitting with each other, I'm going to send you to the office." And this was back in the Stone Ages, when if you got sent to the office, you got paddled. And so the next test came, and sure enough, they sat next to each other, and they kind of looked at me, and they were kind of smiling, seeing what I would do. What they expected I would do is to say, "Okay, boys, remember what I told you? But I have to deliver what I promised." And so what I said was, "Boys, to the office." And they went to the office, and I guess they got paddled, and then they came back, and I said, "Boys, I want you to see me after school today." And so when they came back after school, the first thing I did was I said, "I want to, first of all, ask you if you understand that when I tell you you have to do something, you have to do it." And they said, "Yes, sir, they understand that." And I said, "The second thing I want to tell you is that I want to apologize. I shouldn't have, it didn't fit the crime. I shouldn't have sent you to the office and get paddled for what you were doing. And so I apologize for that. That was my mistake." And we talked a little bit more, And from that point forward, they didn't hate me. As a matter of fact, we were very good friends and some of the best friends, as well as a teacher-student in terms of our relationship. So I had to follow through. I promised it. I made the wrong promise. I had to follow through. If you don't, I mean, many people say things they can't possibly deliver. They'll say things like, I'm going to make you stay after school the rest of your life. Obviously, you can't do that. They're going to say things like, you're going to have to answer all the questions in the back of the book. I mean, that's, again, not something you want to do. And you also don't want to ever give a punishment that cuts off your nose to spite your face. You know, if you're working with a kid that's annoying the crap out of you, you sure don't want to spend more time with them. So don't give them a punishment to say you're going to spend the next 2 weeks in my classroom after school if you're a teacher, or if it's your child. You probably want to put them in timeout or time in, something like that. We'll talk about in just a minute. Other things, funny ones that I've heard people say. I'm never going to speak to you again. Well, obviously, you can't deliver that one. They would say things like, I told you not to climb in the trees. If you climb in the tree and break both of your legs, don't come running to me. Little silly kinds of things like that. But never promise anything that you can't deliver, and never cut off your nose to spite your face. By that I mean, if you're all going to go to dinner, if everybody's ready and one kid's not ready, you don't punish yourself and everyone else by not going to dinner. You find a way to get a babysitter, or if the kid's old enough, they just have to stay home, and you go out and do it. That's the natural consequence. So the next one, the next slide is knowing what's rewarding and what's punishing. This is crucial. Again, remember the example I gave you about me shooting spitballs. Well, the teacher thought it would be a punishment to stand out in the courtyard and be publicly ridiculed by everyone in the school. For me, that was a great reinforcer. The flip side of that is when I was in 5th grade, excuse me, when I was in 5th grade, I had a teacher. I went into school before school started to help the teacher set up the room. I was going to really try to be a good student that year. I had so much trouble in 4th grade and in the younger years. And so I went into the room ahead of time, help her set up things. I was trying to really brown nose the teacher and try to have a good year so my mother wouldn't have to come in and not and have to learn about how terrible her child was. So anyway, school finally started. First thing of the first day, I was the only kid, I guess, that the teacher, whose name the teacher knew. And so they're going to do reading, and she said, Mark, stand up and read page 1. And so here I was punished. I can't read. I couldn't read. I couldn't spell. And here on the first day, after being so good, the teacher punished me by having me stand up and read aloud, which was something that terrified me and was a tremendous punishment. So I was never that good in that class again. I didn't want to be punished like that again. So you got to know what's really what's rewarding and what's punishing. Now, for a young child, being sent to his or her room is probably a punishment. If it's a teenager, being sent to his or her room at that point is probably a reward. There's probably no place they'd rather be, especially if they have a TV and an Xbox and a phone and an iPad. And just go in the room and they would just be, they could stay there all day. Just shove the food under the door and they're good. And the next one is you never punish with anything you want kids to do. So, for example, never punish a kid by saying, go clean up your room. Because what you'll find out is that they will never, ever clean up their room because it brings back such negative feelings. It's a punishment. Instead, you should say, okay, let's go. You want to help me? Let's go clean up the room. And then you go in there and try to make it a fun experience. You want to attach a positive emotion to anything you want kids to do and repeat. You want to attach a negative emotion to anything you want kids to avoid. And that's usually the opposite of the way we do it. Remember in the Mark Leeper example, we tell kids, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, and then we wonder why they do all the things. Because they do it because we haven't attached the positive emotion required to have them want to do it on their own. So I'll give you a couple examples. If you're teaching, doesn't matter what it is, history, math, whatever, and you assign extra problems as punishment, that's just a bad thing. You should do the opposite. Let's say you're teaching math, and the kids are really good in math. They did really well on this exam. You can say, okay, you guys, you did so well, you can take an extra credit math sheet. Go pick one out in the back of the room. That's called the Premack effect. A Premack effect is when you encourage the same behavior by using the same kind of material. So you're encouraging math behavior by using more math problems, and make them extra credit. If you do, it'll be a positive emotional experience. They'll start enjoying math. It will transfer. Another good example is PE. I don't know how many of you are joggers. I'm not a jogger. I wish I was a jogger. I see these people jogging down the street in this state of bliss. I guess it's the jogger high that they get. And I'm saying, wow, that's just nothing I could ever do. The reason is that jogging, for me, is associated with punishment. When I was a kid, the only times I ran long distances was if I was being chased by the bully of the neighborhood, or if I was bad in PE and the coach told me, take a lap. So all of my connections with jogging are somewhat negative. So I won't do it. It just brings up too much negative emotion. Now, fortunately, I love to walk places and hike and things like that, because that gets me high. But there was a PE coach who was one of the best PE coaches I've ever seen. And it's sad to say, if you look at PE coaches, many of them end up not being good role models of what it is that you're supposed to do. But this guy was great. And what he would do is, at the end of every class, he would pick out the 4 or 5 kids that really did well. And it doesn't mean they were the fastest or any of those types of things. It just meant that their behavior, their attitude, they tried hard, all those things were really went well. And he'd say, okay, Billy, Sammy, John, Jared, you get to go. Alice, come on, you get to go. We're going to take a lap. And it was kind of like the victory lap. So coach would be out there running, and everybody would be trying to keep up with coach. And when they got back to the locker room, they were the sweatiest and everything of any group, but they were the proudest. They got to take a lap with the coach. That was a reinforcer, and that was a great role model. So the big questions are, do you want children to do everything you tell them to do? And do you want children to do everything an adult tells them to do? This is a tough one. Obviously we wouldn't tell kids something if we didn't want them to do it. My solution to this is only tell kids things that they have to do. Give them as much choice as you possibly can, but when you tell them they have to do something, then expect them to do it. Don't nitpick them. Don't try to manage every little tiny behavior that they do. Only look for the really important ones, the really critical ones, and then that's what you tell them they have to do. If you do that, then virtually all the time they would comply. The second one's a real interesting one. Do you want children to do everything an adult tells them to do? This is tough. You want your kids to be kind. You want your kids to be obedient. You want your kids to be good citizens. But there are times when you don't want your kids to do what an adult tells them to do, because sometimes there are adults who do bad things and encourage other kids to do bad things. So you want to have fortitude. You want your kids to have fortitude to be able to stand up for doing the right thing, to have some values. And so sometimes it's important to say, no, I will not do this. But when you say, no, you won't do this, it means that you also need to be willing to accept the consequences. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and we had a lot of protests, and you had to decide when you were going to do those protests what was really important to you, and what would you do, and what consequences would you pay for not complying with whatever the adults or the authorities said you had to do. I'll tell you how this came up and why this is so important. We all know from history about the Holocaust, when the Nazis killed 6 to 8 million Jews and other populations in Europe during World War II. When the war ended, they had something called the Nuremberg trials. And the Nuremberg trials were basically war crime um, trials. And many people in the United States said, how could a person march these women and children and men into gas chambers and gas them? I mean, it's just not, it's unthinkable. Um, and when all of the people came on trial who had done it, other than the ringleaders of the whole thing, but other people who complied when the authority told them what they had to do, they complied. Their defense was always, I had to do it. They told me I had to do it. And many Americans would say, well, you didn't really have to. You could have just said no. And so, but if you said no, it might mean that you get pushed into the chamber or you get shot or whatever. So it was very difficult for many Americans and other people around the world to understand the defense that they told me I had to do it. So this fellow named Stanley Milgrams devised an experiment to do here in the United States. And what he did is he set up this artificial situation where a random person off the street would come into his laboratory and would shock another person after failing to answer questions correctly. And the shocks would intensify each time the person missed a question. Now, the person receiving the shock was an actor. And so the actor would at first say, oh, that kind of tingled. And then the shocks would get increasingly more severe. And so, and each time the experimenter, Stanley Milgram, would say to the person, he got the answer wrong, you must shock the person. Sometimes the people would protest and they'd say, well, it's hurting him. Could you go check and see if he's okay? And after about 10 shocks, the actor didn't respond at all. And so Milgrams would say, consider that a wrong answer. So you must go ahead and shock. And so the interesting part was you'd think that a person would say, no, I can't do that. I'm not going to do that. Because they weren't being paid. There was an experiment. They weren't strapped into a chair. Nobody was holding a gun to their head, any of those types of things. They're just average people off the street who came in and were participating in this experiment. And of the people who participated, every single one of them shocked the person all the way to the highest voltage. And just because they were told to do so. And when those people were asked later why they did it, and they just said because they had to. They were told they had to do it, and that's why they did it. So it wasn't just a phenomenon that happened in Germany during World War II. There's a lot of blind obedience that happens in our society as well. And so I want to raise kids, and I want kids to be able to know when it's time to be obedient and when it's time to say, no, this is ethically, morally, humanely incorrect. It's not something that I should be doing, and to be able to stand up for it. So, so that's pretty much the rest of the discipline lecture. So let's finish out this chapter real quickly. The next part is the emerging self, and we start with initiative versus guilt by Erickson. And initiative just means that kids want to take the initiative. They want to do things. They want to be helpful. They want to be participants. They'd rather do things than watch things. And what that means is that they have to have the ability to plan and undertake problems. They have to have the freedom to do it. They have to have the freedom to explore. They need to feel like the world's an exciting place, and I have the capability and the authority to deal with it. That's a really hard thing today because we have become such a hovering society. We're so fearful. And it's become a lot worse since 9/11. When I was a child, we could roam the neighborhood. You know, our parents would let us go out. They didn't worry about us. And I'm saying when we were old enough to take care of ourselves, which for most of us was anywhere from 6 or 7 on. I mean, I would walk to school when I was 6 years old, and the school was about 3/4 of a mile away. Something that would be unheard of or be called child abuse today, maybe, I don't know. But the world has become much more fearful. We have to have play dates. Kids can't go make their own friends. And it's really tough. So we as parents and teachers have to figure out ways to allow kids to have enough freedom to develop that sense of initiative, that they can handle it. If they don't, then they come to think, oh, I'm incapable. Someone else has to find, has to do these for me because I'm really not capable of it. It's kind of like teaching learned helplessness. We teach kids that they're unable to do things. they can't do things, and so they need someone else to solve their problems for them. Not a very good strategy for being either a child or an adult in today's society. So it's tough. If you're a parent, you have to find ways to give kids some opportunity to take the initiative, but still make sure they're protected. When my kids were little, we lived in a little village that was a married student housing village at the University of Florida, and they had a little community store near the playground in the middle of the village. And the nice thing about the village was all the cars had to park all around the perimeter. So once you're in the village, it's a car-safe environment. So anyway, when my kids are I think they're about 4 years old or so, we needed some milk, and so I said, okay, kids, how about going to the little store and get us some milk? And so I gave them $1. Milk was cheap back in those days, and they started heading down to the middle store. Now, again, 4 years old is way too young to let a kid go out on their own, so I went behind them, sneaking along behind them, watching to make sure what they did and how it all went. But as far as they knew, they were on their own. They were taking the initiative. And they went into the store, and they saw where the milk was. It was in one of those milk freezer things, refrigerators. And they stood there, and they tried to open the door, but it was too hard to open. And so they just stood there and watched a little. And they waited until someone else opened the door. And when that person opened the door, one of my twin daughters threw her body into the door to hold it open, and the other one grabbed the milk. And so, and they were pleased with themselves, I have to say, during the whole process, figuring that out, problem solving, taking the initiative. And then, there was about 3 or 4 people waiting in line, but they didn't quite get the notion of waiting in line, so they walked right up to the counter, put the milk down, put the $1 down, and I think the attendant was thought it was so funny. I was looking in the window through all this. They thought it was so funny, they just went ahead and took care of them right then. And then they got a bag and they were heading home. Of course, I was slithering through the bushes still, trying to stay a little bit ahead of them. And so when they finally got into the house and brought the milk, I swear they were 2 inches taller than when they left. They felt the pride of accomplishment. They took the initiative. They figured it out. They did all those things on their own. The flip side of that is guilt. If you don't let kids do things that are within their ability to do, they start to feel guilty about themselves. They say, "Oh, I guess I can't do it. It must be something outside of my ability or control." Now, obviously, there are many things outside their ability and control when they're young, but as they get older, they need to take more and more responsibility and feel less guilty. The way we make the ways we can make kids feel guilty. Kids at this age, 4 years old, will always say, "Why? Why this? Why that?" And sometimes we get very frustrated with them, and we finally say, "Just because I said so." That kind of implies guilt. It implies the fact that you're pestering me, you're bothering me, why are you such trouble? And even the way we phrase some of our statements to kids. If you say to a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old even, you say, or a 6-year-old, or any kid, why don't you ever clean up your room? You're implying guilt. You're saying, you're just not a very good person. You just can't seem to do these things right. Or why can't you get your own drink of water? Or do you have to pester me right now? Or things like that. Instead, you should frame them in terms of the initiative that they have. And if you said things like, "Hey, let's go in and clean up your room. You want to help me?" That's initiative. The kid will say, "Yeah, that's cool." They'll do it. Other things. Would you mind getting the newspaper? Can you sort the coins? Can you shred some papers for me? All those different kinds of things. Kids really want to feel like they make a difference and take the initiative. So we should try to find things that do, and don't ever try to make the kid feel guilty. This chapter also talks about the self-understanding. And at about 18 months, somewhere around those dates, if you put the little dot of rouge on the forehead of the child and showed them a mirror, they would reach up and wipe the rouge off their forehead. That clearly indicates that they know that looking in the mirror, the person they see is in fact them. So it's the first real level of self-understanding. About 2 years old, this is when the no stage comes in. Everything is no, no, no. That's because they really understand that they're separate and unique beings. They're not really connected. mom, dad, caregiver, nanny, whoever it might be, they don't really know what's going on in their head all the time. And so they're testing to see if you do. That's why if you suggest something, they'll just say no. They're looking for boundaries, limits. They're looking to see if you know what they're thinking, basically. And by 36 months of age or so, they're pretty good at defining themselves, but only in gross physical kind of characteristics. I'm a boy, brown hair, green eyes, any of those types of things. So they come to slowly develop this sense of themselves and who they are. Part of the emerging self is coming to understand emotions. We are very emotional beings, and some experts would contend that the first 7 years of life, the major task of the first 7 years of life, is to come to figure out your emotions and how to deal with them. So some of the strategies are self-monitoring. It's like in the Jason story. He tried to figure out how to deal with his emotions, and he first of all had to recognize that he was having an emotional episode. Then he had to gain conscious control of it, and then he had to respond to it. The interesting part is emotions live in the midbrain. They don't live in the prefrontal cortex, where all of our logic, reason, and control tends to be. So what you have to do with young kids is help them learn to connect the emotions that they feel with some kinds of strategies and plans that develop out of the prefrontal cortex. Not an easy thing. But the way you do it is you help with something called self-monitoring. When a kid has an emotion, you say, are you angry? And then that moves the emotion from the emotional midbrain up into the prefrontal cortex, where a child can start to examine it and say, yeah, well, yes, I am angry. And so then you move to self-regulation. You ask them to give a strategy. Well, what can you do when you're angry? Do you have any ideas? And you let kids try to figure out what ideas. In Jason's case, it was leaving the situation. It was running home, in his case, kicking the door in. Now, as he got older, he didn't have to kick the door in. He learned other ways to regulate his emotions. And then the other part of that is there's always going to be emotional stress. It's just part of life. And you've got to let kids experience enough of it that they learn strategies that they can control it. If you don't, you're going to end up with adults and older kids who can't control their emotions. They just lose control totally. And they have either anger management issues or depression issues or things like that. Ways that you do it with young children in this stage, the time out and time in are good examples. Time out is you have some place you put them. When they've lost control, you put them in a place where they can be safe, calm, and start thinking and becoming more thoughtful about what's going on. That's time out. Time in is something that started fairly recently, which I really like, and it's doing things like yoga, mindfulness, and meditation with kids to help them learn to deal and cope with emotions and get more emotional control. I have done that with my grandkids. It's a lot of fun. We help them either through breathing exercises or other mindfulness techniques to gain more control over their emotions. The trick for stress, too, is that you've got to let kids experience stress. This is one of the hardest things a parent or teacher can do. But it has to be stress within their ability to cope with it. You, as an adult, you must protect kids if the stress is so significant that they're not likely to handle it. But in many cases, they just need to deal with it on their own. You can't save them. You can't protect them. Every time you protect a kid from the normal and natural consequences of an action that caused the kid stress, you're stealing from them. You're stealing a lesson. You're stealing their ability to develop that cognitive process that's going to allow them to cope with that stress as they get older. So it's really tough to not be overprotective of kids, but it's one of those must-do things. If you overprotect a kid, then they don't have the skills, and when they become an older child and an adult, they're fairly unhappy for not having the ability to deal with stressful situations. And the way you gauge it is by looking for reactions and recovery time. If you could think of it this way, there's an event that triggers an emotional reaction, and it could be anything, but something that triggers an emotional reaction. you look at the amount of time it takes for the prefrontal cortex to catch up. And so I'm going to use, if you look at the little video, I'm going to use my fingers. Here's an event that triggers an emotional reaction. And what happens is, after it's triggered, then a certain amount of time passes until you can catch up. Your prefrontal cortex cuts in and says, oh, okay, yeah, I see I'm acting emotionally right now. Now, if a person has anger management issues, this catching up goes way off the scale. They have the trigger, and it takes so long for them to actually catch up. If it's a minor thing, like for example, you ever catch yourself all of a sudden being happy? Something happened that was really cool, and you start feeling really good inside, and then all of a sudden it takes your brain, your cognitive processing, and say, wow, that was a really neat thing that happened. And sometimes, again, when you get angry, it triggers the event, but it takes a little while to figure out what made you angry. So you have to watch in kids and make sure that you see what the reaction was and see what the recovery time is. And it has to be, then you know what kind of stresses they can deal with at that point. And so the stresses need to, again, be something that is reasonable for the kids to deal with. Okay. Come on. Hey, that's all I was going to cover in that chapter, but as a special treat, I want you to, I've talked about Tucker sometimes. Tucker, come on, up here. Come on, up. Come on. There. This is Tucker. Say hi. Hi, everybody. Want to wave? This is my Tucker boy. Anyway, I just thought I'd let you see the good fellow, and obviously I'm home today. Hey, Tucker, give me a kiss. Give me a kiss. Tucker, give me a kiss. Yeah, thank you. That's really good. Okay, well, that's the end of this little video, and we will see you in class shortly. Bye.